It was the moment the lawyer broke the wax seal and read the reserved addendum that everything changed. As the room waited in tense silence, Calvin lunged at me, slapping me hard in front of everyone. He thought that would break me, but the smile on my face, that wasn't for him. It was for the trap that had been set weeks ago. A trap I'd built piece by piece to expose the family betrayal that had been unfolding for years. And now, it was time to make things right. Nora Whitfield's life had always been a bit complicated, but when Calvin Rohr came into the picture, things took a turn that felt suffocating. You see, after her father passed, Nora's mom, Elaine, was vulnerable, grieving, tired, and desperate for some sense of stability. She wasn't exactly in the best position to see through Calvin's act. Calvin swept in like a knight in shining armor, rich, suave, and promising her the world. But what he gave her was a cage. He wasn't a prince. He was a tyrant in disguise. When they married, Calvin wasted no time taking control. The old Victorian townhouse, once a place filled with laughter and memories of Nora's father, became his kingdom, his rules. And as much as Nora hated to admit it, she felt the shift right away. Everything she had once called home, every corner that used to smell like comfort, was now tainted by his presence. He didn't just move in, he ruled. It didn't take long for him to make it clear who held the power in that house. Calvin wasn't subtle about it. He announced the first week that the house was his. The room where Nora's dad used to read her stories that became Calvin's study. He made sure that the best rooms, the garage, the prime space in the house were all his. The rules, simple, really. Whoever pays the bills makes the decisions, he said. Nora's mom, too tired to argue, chose silence. She always did. Silence became her only armor. And it worked for Calvin. He didn't have to hear a word of protest. He just had to make it clear that he was in charge. Nora, on the other hand, had no choice but to shrink. Her job as a pediatric nurse at North Ferry Children's Hospital was demanding. Long hours, difficult patients, and the constant beeping of machines. It was honest work, hard work. But to Calvin, it was nothing. He looked down on her with a sneer. Wiping noses for a living, he'd say at the dinner table, cutting into his steak, while Nora pushed her food around on her plate. To him, she was invisible. A nurse. Just a nurse. Not worthy of respect, not worthy of acknowledgement, not worthy of anything but disdain. The power imbalance was clear. Calvin had money, status, and an ego the size of a small country. And Nora, she had her job, her integrity, and her mother, who had over time become more of a shadow of herself. Elaine had disappeared into her marriage. She wasn't the same woman Nora remembered. She was smaller now, diminished. The mother Nora once knew was now quiet, small, and barely there. Calvin had broken her down piece by piece. His criticisms, his demands, his superiority had worn her thin. Elaine's salary as a nurse's aide barely covered her car payment, and Calvin made sure she knew it. He never let her forget it. Every time she tried to voice an opinion, Calvin made it clear that she was nothing, a woman too tired to defend herself, too exhausted to push back, and too beaten down to stand up to him. In Calvin's world, only his voice mattered. Nora tried to stay out of the way. She kept her room barely. The small bedroom overlooking the garden where she grew up, the same room where her father used to tell her stories, before the world turned upside down. She clung to that room like a lifeline. It was the only piece of her childhood that was still hers. But even there, Calvin's presence loomed. He tolerated her because throwing out his wife's daughter would make him look bad. But tolerance, as Nora soon learned, isn't acceptance. Tolerance means you're not wanted, but you're allowed to exist in the periphery, out of sight, out of mind. Tyler, Calvin's son from a previous marriage, had no such problem. He acted like the house was his, like he was royalty. He was 28, soft around the middle, a little too confident for someone with no real work ethic. He worked for Rohr Construction and Sons, but his contribution seemed limited to showing up late, leaving early, and running his mouth when it suited him. Tyler enjoyed the privileges of being Calvin's son, the best room, the nicest car, and the belief that everything belonged to him by birthright. It made Nora sick, watching him lounge around, stretch out on the couch she had helped her mom pick out years ago. Dad's house, Dad's rules. He'd smirk, as if reminding Nora that she was nothing in the face of the Rohr name. To him, she was just an unwanted guest in his father's world. But there was one person who treated Nora like family, Grandma Violet. She lived across town in a modest 2-story home that smelled like lavender and old books. Every Sunday, Nora would drive over to visit, to drink tea with her, and for a few precious hours, breathe. Grandma Violet was a rock for Nora, a steady presence in a life filled with turmoil. "Don't let him chase you out," Grandma Violet would say, her fingers still graceful despite her arthritis. Grandma had lived through tough times herself. She knew how to read people, how to recognize when someone was being taken advantage of. "This too shall pass, sweetheart. Men like Calvin always overreach," she would say. Nora didn't know it at the time, but Grandma Violet was already planning. She knew what was coming. When Grandma Violet's health started to decline, things changed again. Small strokes stole her words and memories, and Calvin suddenly started showing interest in her finances. Before, he had never so much as acknowledged Grandma Violet's existence, except for the occasional polite nod at family gatherings. But now, he was offering to help with her finances. "Just want to make sure Elaine is taken care of," he would say. That salesman's smile stretched across his face. Mom was grateful for the help, too tired to question it. But Nora was suspicious, and she didn't know if it was just paranoia or something more. But suspicion, without proof, didn't hold much weight. And in a house where Nora was already unwelcome, suspicion marked her as the problem. But the day Grandma Violet forgot Nora's name, that's when everything changed. It was a day that stuck in her mind. Calvin had visited that morning, as usual, checking in on Grandma, just making sure she's okay. He had said. But that day, Grandma wasn't okay. She had been fine the day before, sharp enough to beat Nora at Scrabble. But now, she was confused. It wasn't just the Victorians settling. Something was shifting in the house's foundation. And it wasn't just the house that was unstable. It was everything. Calvin's meetings with estate lawyers started in secret. The door to the study was locked now. Tyler began making casual hints about big changes that were coming, with that smugness of someone who knew they were protected. "Maybe you should start looking for your own place," Tyler suggested one evening, apropos of nothing. 34 and still living at home doesn't look good. Nora wanted to remind him that 28 and failing upward at Daddy's company looked worse. But she didn't say anything. Silence was the only way to survive in that house. Calvin had already made his position clear. There were two kinds of Piep in that house, Roars, and everyone else. But there was something more to Grandma Violet's warning. It wasn't just philosophical. Grandma knew how to fight. She had taught Nora something important during those Sundays over tea and shortbread. Sometimes the smartest way to handle a bully isn't to strike back immediately. Sometimes it's to wait, observe, and let them unravel on their own. And Nora, knowing what she had to do, simply waited. She just had to make sure she was holding the other end when they did. Grandma Violet had always been Nora's emotional anchor. Her house, a modest two-story that smelled of lavender and old books, was the place Nora went to escape the chaos at home. Every Sunday, she would drive over for tea, and for a few precious hours, she could breathe. Grandma Violet's calm presence was a respite from the madness that was her life. She didn't just offer words of wisdom, though she had plenty of those, but the kind of quiet understanding that made Nora feel seen in a world where she often felt invisible. Grandma Violet was the one person who treated Nora like she mattered. Like she wasn't just the leftover daughter in a house ruled by Calvin. She never dismissed Nora's feelings or brushed off her concerns. In Grandma's house, Nora could be herself, away from the oppressive weight of her stepfather's disdain and her mother's quiet resignation. "Don't let him chase you out, sweetheart," Grandma would say, her frail fingers still elegant despite the arthritis that had started to take hold. Men like Calvin always overreach. At the time, Nora thought Grandma meant it as some kind of philosophical life lesson, something she would tell any woman who found herself in a tough spot. But she didn't know then that Grandma was already planning for what was to come. When Grandma's health began to decline, Nora could see the changes. The strokes started small, almost unnoticed at first. Words would escape her, memories would fade, but those little signs were enough to make Nora worry. And the more she noticed, the more the worry grew. Grandma had always been sharp. She had taught Nora how to play Scrabble, beat her at it regularly, and always seemed to have an answer for everything. But now, there were moments when Grandma's mind seemed to wander. She'd forget the names of things she'd known her entire life, sometimes even Nora's name. And it wasn't just physical frailty, it was the way her mind seemed to slip away, like a slow tide washing over a beach, taking bits of the shoreline with it each day. That's when Calvin began showing an interest in Grandma Violet's affairs. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. He started visiting her more often, offering to help with her finances, handling paperwork for her. At first, Nora wasn't too concerned. She was used to Calvin's self-serving nature, and if he was helping Grandma, well, that was one less thing for Nora to worry about, right? But that something didn't sit right. It wasn't like Calvin to suddenly be concerned about anyone other than himself. His motives were always so obvious to Nora. Everything he did had an angle. Every nice gesture he made had strings attached. "Just want to make sure Elaine's taken care of," he'd say to Nora, wearing that slimy salesman smile of his. And making sure Violet's finances are in order. There was always an excuse for his visits to Grandma, but Nora could see through it. He wasn't just trying to help. He was calculating. He was always calculating. He wasn't interested in Grandma Violet's health or well-being. He was interested in her assets. At first, Nora tried to push the feeling aside. She didn't want to be paranoid. But the signs were becoming harder to ignore. Grandma had never been particularly trusting of anyone, especially men. But now, with her health slipping, she was more vulnerable. And Calvin was taking advantage of that vulnerability in ways Nora couldn't quite put into words yet. He'd started making moves that made her uncomfortable. He'd offer to help her with bills or sort out paperwork for her. But Nora knew enough to realize that the help he was offering wasn't free. There were always strings attached. When he wasn't around, Grandma's bank statements showed things disappearing, payments to unknown companies, large sums of money transferred, and then nothing. Just a few empty lines on the page. And then, one day, Grandma forgot Nora's name. Just like that. A slip. A little moment where Grandma's sharpness seemed to fade. Nora had been over for their usual Sunday tea, and Grandma had looked at her, confused. You're my granddaughter, right?" she had asked, looking at Nora as though she were a stranger. Nora had frozen. She'd tried to laugh it off at first, but the knot in her stomach twisted. Grandma wasn't the type to forget, especially not something as important as who Nora was. But that day, It was as if the thread holding Grandma's memory together had snapped. Nora felt a chill that went beyond the temperature in the room. It wasn't just the stroke anymore. This was something different. And that was when Nora really started to pay attention. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with doctors and long conversations with Grandma, trying to piece together what was happening to her. It was clear now that Grandma wasn't the same woman she had been before. Her mind was slipping away, and there was nothing Nora could do to stop it. Calvin, however, seemed to have noticed the shift as well. His visits became more frequent. Just checking in on Violet, making sure she's all right, he would say, always with that infuriatingly calm demeanor. But Nora wasn't fooled. Calvin didn't care about Grandma's health. He cared about her assets. He started asking more questions about Grandma's estate. What was left to her? Did she have a will? What about trusts? Was everything in order? He asked these questions under the guise of being helpful. But Nora could hear the undertone of something darker beneath his words. The questions weren't for Grandma, they were for him. And Nora began to wonder if he was already positioning himself to take what wasn't his. One afternoon, Nora caught Calvin in the study, sitting at Grandma's desk, going through paperwork, just making sure everything's in order, he had said. But there was an edge to his voice that made Nora's skin crawl. He was in Grandma's personal files, flipping through documents, and she knew he didn't have permission to do so. He was searching for something to exploit, something he could use to get what he wanted. When Grandma had begun to show signs of confusion, Calvin was quick to take advantage of it. He started pushing for power of attorney, suggesting that someone needed to step in and make decisions on Grandma's behalf. He was always so helpful, making it sound like he was just looking out for her best interests. But Nora wasn't stupid. She saw through the act. This wasn't about protecting Grandma. This was about Calvin getting control over her money and assets before anyone else noticed what he was doing. And then, one evening, Tyler made a comment that left Nora reeling. "Maybe you should start looking for your own place," he had said, as though the idea of her still being there, under the same roof as him and Calvin, was some kind of inconvenience. 34 and still living at home doesn't look good. It was a casual remark, but it stung. It reminded Nora just how little she mattered in this house. To Calvin, she was nothing more than an obstacle, something to be tolerated until she could be pushed out. And Tyler was more than happy to play along with his father's agenda, but Nora wasn't about to let them win. Not this time. Grandma had always taught her to wait for the right moment, to be patient. Sometimes the best way to handle a bully wasn't to strike back immediately, it was to wait, watch, and let them unravel on their own. And Nora was prepared to do just that. She just had to make sure she was holding the other end when they did. The real turning point came when Nora found the document, the mortgage agreement with a $200,000 lien against Grandma's house. Calvin had been involved. Of course, the signature on the document was suspicious. It looked like Grandma's handwriting, but it wasn't quite right. The V in Violet was too sharp. The final T was trailing in a way that didn't match. Nora knew Grandma's handwriting like she knew her own, and this was off. The beneficiary Roar, Construction and Sons, Calvin's company, that was when everything clicked. This wasn't just about control, it was about Calvin taking everything he could, piece by piece without anyone noticing until it was too late. And he had been doing it for months, using his position as family to take advantage of Grandma's declining health. From that moment on, Nora was on high alert. She had the proof now. Calvin wasn't just manipulating Grandma's finances, he was stealing from her. And she wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. It was the discovery of the mortgage agreement that changed everything for Nora. The moment she saw that document, a $200,000 lien against Grandma Violet's house. Her heart sank. She wasn't snooping through Calvin's desk. She had a legitimate reason for being there. The Wi-Fi password had been changed again, and Calvin's habit of hiding it in his desk drawer had become routine. But when she reached in and found that letterhead second lien mortgage agreement, she almost couldn't breathe. Grandma's address was staring back at her. It didn't take long to realize that something was deeply wrong. Nora had grown up knowing her grandmother's handwriting like she knew her own. Every birthday card, every note, those were treasures. So when she saw the signature on that document, she knew immediately that something wasn't right. The V in Violet was too sharp. The last T of her name had an awkward flourish that didn't belong. It wasn't Grandma. It couldn't have been. But the name at the bottom of the document, that was Calvin Rohr's company, Rohr Construction and Sons. Her hands shook as she quickly photographed the pages with her phone. The reality of what she was seeing settling in. It wasn't just a slip or an oversight. Calvin had done this intentionally. It wasn't the first time, either. She could feel it in her bones, a sense of foreboding as the pieces started to fit together. This was part of a larger scheme, something much more calculated. And her suspicions, which had started small, were now confirmed. Calvin wasn't just living in the house, making it his kingdom. He was taking what wasn't his. He had his sights set on Grandma Violet's house, her estate, everything she had worked her whole life to build. Nora didn't have all the pieces yet, but she had a start. She knew she couldn't go to her mother yet. Elaine was too exhausted, too worn down to handle something this heavy. She was just beginning to regain a semblance of herself, and Nora wasn't about to pile this on top of her. Calvin had already worn her thin, made her believe that silence was the only way to survive in their house. No, Nora had to handle this herself. It wasn't just her grandmother's money at stake. It was the family's future. The legacy that Calvin was trying to erase with every paper he signed. Nora started with the bank statements. Grandma had added her to the accounts years ago. As a precaution. Just in case, she'd said. Though Nora hadn't fully understood what she meant at the time, now with every transaction she looked at, Nora could see the bleed. It started small. A $5,000 transfer here, a $8,000 wire there. At first, it was easy to dismiss as normal. Maybe an unusual bill, maybe Grandma's medical expenses. But the more Nora looked, the more she realized this wasn't just a few odd transactions. In 6 months, nearly $50,000 had vanished. Transfers to companies she had never heard of, payments to accounts that didn't make sense, all coinciding with Calvin's visits. She knew now that these weren't accidental. Calvin was stealing, and he had been for months. The more Nora looked, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. She knew she had to get more evidence. One night, she stayed late at work, scrolling through the hospital's database, reviewing Grandma's medical records. Nora had been her healthcare proxy for years, and so she was allowed access. But what she found sent a chill down her spine. The neurologist's notes from Grandma's most recent checkup were telling. They weren't definitive, but they weren't vague either. Patient shows intermittent confusion, particularly in evening hours. The note read, lucidity varies, recommend financial oversight. The confusion Grandma experienced didn't just appear on paper, it was real. Nora had seen it, but the part that stung was the way Calvin had been exploiting it. He wasn't just taking advantage of Grandma's declining health, he was timing it. He was waiting for the moments when she was most vulnerable. He'd arrive at the house, offer her a cup of tea, and slowly start to ask questions about her finances. It wasn't just the money that made Nora's blood boil, it was the manipulation, the slow poisoning of a once strong woman. Calvin knew exactly what he was doing, and now Nora knew it too. As she started piecing things together, it became clear that Grandma wasn't the only one in danger. Calvin's son, Tyler, was complicit in this scheme. Even if he didn't realize it, Tyler wasn't exactly known for his brains. He had always coasted on the coattails of his father's business, showing up late to work, leaving early, and generally failing upward. But he wasn't stupid. He knew where the money was, and he made sure to remind Nora of the power he thought he had. One night, as they were sitting in the living room, Tyler had casually mentioned something that set off alarms in Nora's head. Once the old lady's estate is settled, Dad says I'm getting a promotion. Real money, not the penny ante stuff. Nora was stunned. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't want to tip him off, but it was clear now. Tyler wasn't just planning on inheriting. He was already preparing to spend what wasn't his. The words estate and promotion shouldn't have been in the same sentence, especially when it was about Grandma Violet. But for Tyler, it was already settled. He was going to take what he could, and the rest could burn. Nora made sure to record that conversation. Connecticut had one-party consent laws for recordings, and she knew she'd need every scrap of evidence to take down Calvin and Tyler when the time came. The investigation wasn't just about bank statements and medical records. Nora knew she needed more. She started tracking Calvin's visits, paying attention to the exact times he was at Grandma's house. It wasn't easy to track him without alerting him. But she had an old friend, Jake, who worked in city planning. Jake was always on the inside of things: permits, zoning laws, and building codes. It wasn't long before she called him up. Jake, I need you to look into some construction permits for me. Rohr Construction & Sons, anything related to projects Calvin might be working on. Jake agreed without hesitation. A week later, he sent Nora a handful of documents that made her stomach turn. There were invoices from Rohr Construction for projects that didn't exist, invoices for supplies that had never been ordered, payments for equipment that didn't show up on any active job sites. Jake had dug deep. Rohr's been billing for ghost projects, he told Nora over coffee. There's no construction happening at these addresses. Half of them are vacant lots. The other half haven't seen any action in years. It all started to fall into place. Calvin wasn't just siphoning money from Grandma's accounts. He was running a shell game with his construction company. The funds that should have gone into real projects were being funneled somewhere else. To him, to Tyler, to anyone who could help cover up the fraud. Nora kept digging, making sure to document everything. She photographed every piece of evidence, from bank statements to forged signatures, from empty construction sites to the ghost contractors registered in Delaware under suspicious names: CRK Holdings, Rohr Asset Management, Tyler Industries, LLC. Each company name was more laughable than the last, and each was tied back to Calvin. But the investigation wasn't just about catching Calvin in the act. It was about finding a way to build a case without tipping him off. That's where Harper Lell came in. Harper was a lawyer, a tough one, the kind of person who knew the ins and outs of the system. Nora met with Harper to discuss what she had found. This is extensive, Harper said, flipping through the stack of evidence Nora had gathered. But we need more for criminal charges. Financial abuse cases are difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Nora wasn't discouraged. She had learned from Grandma Violet that sometimes the best way to fight wasn't to rush in head first. Sometimes the best way to fight was to wait, to gather the right evidence, and to be patient. It wasn't just about bringing Calvin down. It was about making sure he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Nora continued to monitor Calvin's every move, her every conversation with him, every time he showed up at Grandma's house. She recorded every word, every moment that seemed suspicious, knowing that at some point it would all come to a head. She had the documentation now. All she needed was the right moment to spring the trap. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. Calvin, frustrated by the trust documents Harper had filed, made his fatal mistake. He tried to get Grandma to sign a revocation. He was there one evening, off schedule, with a lawyer who was not one of the usual faces. That night, Nora had everything she needed. She had the recording of Calvin pressuring Grandma to sign the papers. She had the proof of his manipulation. As the evidence piled up, Nora could feel the walls closing in on Calvin. The moment she'd been waiting for was coming closer. But before it could all unfold, she knew one thing for sure: Calvin wasn't going to get away with it. Not this time. She was ready to make him pay for every penny he'd stolen from Grandma Violet, for every lie, every manipulation, and every moment he'd thought he could get away with it. Nora knew she needed more than just evidence. She needed a plan, a foolproof one. And that's when she turned to Harper Lell, the lawyer she'd met when things had started to spiral. Harper wasn't just any lawyer. She was sharp, precise, and experienced, with a reputation for handling cases where the stakes were high and the outcome uncertain. Most importantly, Harper knew exactly how to navigate the minefield Nora was facing. She wasn't just trying to expose Calvin for the thief he was. She was going to make sure he paid for everything he'd done. It was going to take time, patience, and a lot of meticulous planning. But with Harper by her side, Nora felt like she finally had someone who was as invested in this as she was. The first time they met, Nora felt a sense of urgency in the air. Harper's office, tucked away in a converted bank building, was the kind of place that whispered power. The mahogany desk, the polished floors, the silence that hung in the air. It felt like the kind of place where secrets were kept. Harper herself was in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When Nora walked in, Harper looked up from her desk, taking in the younger woman's quiet determination. There was no need for pleasantries. Nora didn't come here for small talk. "What have you got?" Harper asked simply. The weight of the question hanging between them, Nora didn't waste any time. She laid out everything she had gathered so far: the fraudulent bank transactions, the forged signature on the mortgage document, the ghost contractors, and the recorded conversations with Tyler that exposed their plans. Harper listened intently, not interrupting, but her eyes never left the papers Nora slid across the desk. When Nora finished, Harper sat back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the wood. She didn't speak for a moment, and Nora began to feel a familiar knot of doubt in her stomach. Had she missed something? Was there a flaw in her investigation? But then Harper's lips curved into a knowing smile, and the tension in Nora's shoulders relaxed. "You've done well," Harper said quietly. "You've got the foundation, but Calvin's a smart man. We need more than just this. We need a strategy. We need to build a case that's airtight, something he can't wriggle out of, and we need to do it without tipping him off." Nora's heart beat faster at the thought. She had no intention of giving Calvin the chance to turn the tables. The plan had to be executed with precision, every detail accounted for. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but with Harper's guidance, she felt a sense of resolve she hadn't known she had. Over the next few weeks, Nora and Harper worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They knew they had to gather the right evidence, but more importantly, they had to build the perfect legal trap, one that would catch Calvin at his most arrogant. Harper's first piece of advice was to keep a low profile. If Calvin suspected that someone was onto him, he would do everything in his power to cover his tracks. That meant Nora couldn't just confront him with her findings. They had to work in the shadows, gathering what they could without drawing attention to themselves. One of the first steps was to secure the chain of evidence. Everything they had already collected, the forged mortgage, the bank transactions, the recordings, had to be kept secure and well documented. Harper explained that even the slightest misstep could ruin their chances of getting Calvin to pay for his crimes. So, Nora began creating backups. She transferred the recordings to secure USB drives, made copies of the photos she had taken, and carefully labeled every piece of evidence Everything needed to be above reproach. At the same time, Harper began preparing the legal framework. They needed to prove that Calvin had manipulated Grandma Violet's finances, but they also had to show the extent of the exploitation. It wasn't enough to catch him in the act. Nora and Harper needed to prove a pattern of financial abuse. That meant going back through every transaction that had been made under Calvin's watch, starting with the moment he'd first started visiting Grandma Violet. Harper sent Nora to the bank with the proper documentation to gain access to Grandma's records. It was a delicate task. She couldn't simply show up and demand everything that would raise too many questions. Instead, she worked behind the scenes, coordinating with the bank's legal department to get the necessary paperwork without arousing suspicion. Every transaction, every wire transfer, every withdrawal that seemed even remotely suspicious was documented. Nora found more evidence of Calvin's manipulation, small sums that added up to a large amount. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into accounts controlled by companies with no legitimate purpose. But Harper knew that bank records alone wouldn't be enough. They needed more tangible evidence, something that would hit Calvin where it hurt. That's when Harper suggested they focus on the will. The Violet Whitfield Trust was the key. If they could prove that Calvin had coerced Grandma Violet into changing the will or signing fraudulent documents, it would be game over. But proving coercion wasn't easy. It required specific legal expertise. And that was where Harper came in. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Harper arranged for an independent legal expert to review the documents that had been signed during Grandma Violet's supposed moments of confusion. They needed to establish that Grandma had the capacity to make decisions, even in her declining health. They couldn't let Calvin claim that Grandma didn't know what she was doing. Harper also made sure to take the necessary legal precautions. They drafted power of attorney documents that would protect Grandma's interests, ensuring that no one could take advantage of her again. But these documents weren't just for show, they were carefully timed and witnessed. They needed to be airtight, with proper medical professionals confirming Grandma's cognitive state. Harper arranged for 2 doctors to be present, as well as a social worker, to make sure everything was above board. Video recordings were made, documenting every step of the process. They would need these to prove that Grandma had the mental clarity to make decisions, even if Calvin tried to claim otherwise. At the same time, Nora continued her investigation. She kept an eye on Calvin, documenting every interaction with Grandma. She visited her grandmother on her good days, when she was lucid, to review the trust documents and other important papers. The more she learned, the more she realized how deeply Calvin had infiltrated every part of their lives. He wasn't just stealing money, he was trying to erase Grandma Violet's legacy, turning her hard-earned wealth into his own personal fortune. One evening, as Nora was reviewing documents with Grandma, she saw something that made her heart race. It was a letter from a lawyer, one that had been filed by Calvin under the guise of helping Grandma with her finances. But it was more than that. The letter was a request for a revocation of the trust. Calvin had been trying to manipulate Grandma into signing it, convincing her that the trust was outdated, that it needed to be changed. It was a last-ditch effort to erase the provisions that protected Grandma's assets. Nora couldn't let it happen. She had to act fast. Harper's plan was taking shape, and now it was time for the final phase. They had everything they needed: the recordings, the bank statements, the documents, and the witness testimony. But Nora had one last step to complete. She had to make sure that Calvin didn't see it coming. So, she kept quiet. She played the part of the dutiful daughter, waiting for the right moment. Calvin was getting more arrogant by the day, and he didn't even know that the walls were closing in on him. Harper had one final piece of advice for Nora. When you have him, make sure you have everything. Don't leave anything to chance. One mistake, and it could all fall apart. Nora knew what that meant. They couldn't afford to rush. They had to wait until they had every single piece of evidence in place. Only then could they strike. And so, Nora waited. She continued to watch Calvin, to gather evidence, to document every detail. She felt the pressure building, but she didn't break. She was ready. The trap was set, and Calvin had no idea that he was walking right into it. The day of the will reading arrived with a sense of finality that made Nora's stomach churn. She had prepared herself for this moment, but as she walked into the law office with her mother and Calvin, the weight of it all settled in. It was as though the air itself was thick with tension, the kind of tension that you could feel in your bones. It had been building for months, and now everything would come to a head. They entered the office of Brennan and Associates, a place that felt old and heavy with the weight of legacy. The dark wood paneling, the polished mahogany furniture, it was the kind of place where secrets were kept and deals were made. It felt both reassuring and suffocating, as though the past was about to speak, and none of them were ready for the truth it would reveal. Calvin had his usual air of smug confidence, his tailored suit sharp and precise, his smile like a well-rehearsed performance. Nora could see the way he carried himself, like he was already imagining the spoils of victory. He wasn't worried. He believed the house, the assets, everything Grandma Violet had worked for would fall into his hands just like he'd planned. Nora had been watching him for months, documenting every step, and she knew the truth: he was about to lose everything. But Nora wasn't so sure about her mother. Elaine had grown so quiet, her face drawn with exhaustion. She wasn't speaking much these days, and when she did, it was only to placate Calvin or answer his questions. The woman Nora had once looked up to seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a shadow of herself that had been worn down by years of manipulation. But today, Nora wasn't going to let that happen. She had a plan. And it wasn't just about Grandma's estate anymore. It was about taking back control, about showing her mother that it was possible to stand up to Calvin, to fight for what was right. They sat around the table, the cold silence thick between them. Calvin glanced at his watch, a little too casually. He knew the will would be read, and he thought it would be straightforward, simple. Elaine would inherit, and Calvin would get everything he'd been scheming for. Tyler, standing awkwardly beside him, fidgeted with his phone. It was clear that neither of them had any idea what was about to happen. The junior partner, Samuel Chen, had already made his presence felt. He was a tall, composed man in his 40s, with a poker face that made it impossible to read him. He had no interest in small talk, no pleasantries to offer. Instead, he placed a manila envelope, sealed with red wax, in front of him on the table. Calvin's eyes narrowed as he saw the envelope, but he said nothing. He was too confident in his own position. "We'll begin," Chen said simply, his voice calm and professional. "Please state your names and your relationship to the deceased for the record." Calvin was the first to speak, his voice smooth and sure. Calvin Rohr, husband of Elaine Whitfield Rohr, Violet's daughter. He gave his usual self-assured smile, but something in his eyes flickered as he glanced at Nora. Tyler followed suit, then Elaine, and finally Nora, who said nothing, but her heart was pounding in her chest. She didn't need to say anything. The documents in front of them spoke louder than words ever could. Chen nodded and carefully opened the envelope. As he began reading, Calvin shifted forward, his attention peaked. The will was as straightforward as they had expected. "To my daughter, Elaine Whitfield Rohr, I leave my love and the hope that she finds her strength again." There was a slight pause as the room absorbed the words, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. But then Chen moved on to the next section. "The remainder of my estate," he continued, "is to be placed in the Violet Whitfield Revocable Trust, established 6 weeks before my passing. Trustees to be First National Bank and my granddaughter, Nora Whitfield." The air in the room froze. The temperature dropped as though a window had been thrown open in the dead of winter. Calvin's face went pale, His hand tightened on the armrest of his chair as if he was trying to hold himself together, but his fingers were trembling. Nora could see the blood drain from his face as he tried to process what he had just heard. "What? No," Calvin growled, his voice rising with disbelief. "This can't be right. There must be some mistake. This is fraudulent." Violet wasn't competent to make these changes. Chen's expression didn't falter. "I assure you, Mr. Roar, the will is valid. It was executed and witnessed according to the law, and the changes were made with full legal capacity." He paused for effect. "There is more." Calvin's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, the muscles in his jaw clenching. He was no longer hiding his anger. "I've seen the earlier will. This is not what Violet wanted. She was confused she was sick." His voice grew more desperate, but Chen continued, his tone unwavering. "The trust includes specific provisions. Elaine Whitfield Roar shall have lifetime residency rights to the Elmwood property, which shall be maintained by the trust. Upon her passing or voluntary relocation, the property shall transfer to Nora Whitfield." The words were a gut punch to Calvin. He blinked, his face flushed with rage. Nora could see it now. He had thought everything would go his way. He thought he would get what he wanted with a few well-placed manipulations. But now, in this room, in front of everyone, he was realizing the extent of his mistake. This wasn't just a will. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. It was about power. And Calvin had lost both. "This is fraud," Calvin shouted, standing up from his chair, his voice trembling with fury. "This isn't possible. You're lying." Chen's voice remained calm, almost clinical, as he reached into the envelope for the final piece of the puzzle. "You are mistaken, Mr. Roar. This is the sealed addendum. It was to be opened only in the event of a contested will or claims of undue influence." Chen broke the seal with deliberate care, his eyes flicking over the contents as he read aloud. "The addendum, witnessed by Dr. Patricia Huang and Dr. Robert Morrison of Millwater General Hospital, states the following. Should any party contest this will or claim undue influence, the following evidence shall be submitted to the probate court and relevant authorities." He paused, letting the words sink in. Calvin's fists were clenched at his sides, his face now red with rage. "Documentation of systematic financial exploitation totaling $247,000, Chen continued, his eyes never leaving the document. "Forged signatures on mortgage documents, recorded conversations demonstrating coercion, medical records showing attempts to obtain signatures during documented periods of confusion." Calvin's knees buckled slightly, as if the weight of the truth had finally hit him. He staggered back, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words. But they wouldn't come. Tyler's face went pale, his eyes darting from his father to the papers on the table. Not understanding what was happening, Nora couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. "Furthermore," Chen added, "any party found guilty of financial exploitation of the deceased shall be subject to disgorgement of all improperly obtained assets and barred from any benefit from the estate." Calvin's entire demeanor crumbled. "You set this up," he said, his voice cracking with disbelief and rage. He turned toward Nora, his eyes burning with fury. "You manipulated a sick old woman. I have video recordings," Chen interrupted smoothly, his voice sharp and precise, "of Mrs. Whitfield explaining her wishes in detail with full medical competency evaluations performed before each revision." Chen looked directly at Calvin. "Would you like to see them, Mr. Roar?" It was in that moment that Nora's plan clicked into place. All the careful work, all the evidence, all the patience. This was the moment it all came together. Calvin was cornered and he didn't even know it. His arrogance, his belief that he could bend everyone to his will, had blinded him to the trap that had been set for him. But Calvin wasn't finished. His voice shook as he turned to Tyler, his last hope. "Tyler, we're leaving," he snapped, his eyes wild. "Get up. We'll take care of this later." Tyler, however, wasn't moving. He was staring at his phone, his face confused. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on? Why are the accounts frozen?" Calvin froze, and Nora saw the moment of realization in his eyes. The smile she had been holding back finally slipped onto her face. This was it, the end of Calvin's reign. "Mr. Rohr," Chen said, glancing at the door, "there are some people here who'd like to speak with you about mortgage fraud, elder abuse, and embezzlement." At that moment, the door to the office swung open. Deputy Martinez, followed by 2 other officers, entered the room. "Put the paperweight down, Mr. Rohr," Deputy Martinez said firmly, her hand resting on her service weapon. "You're under arrest for assault and battery." The room erupted into chaos as Calvin lunged at Nora, his anger spilling over into violence. But it was too late. The legal trap had been set, and it had caught him perfectly. Calvin's fate was sealed, and there was nothing he could do to escape it. Nora stood there, her heart pounding, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of justice. She had won. Grandma Violet had won, and Calvin's world was about to come crashing down around him. As the officers took Calvin away, Tyler's face twisted with confusion, but it was too late for him. The law was no longer on their side. Nora's smile stayed with her, hidden behind her lips. But it was their victory, sweet and hard-earned, was finally hers. With Calvin's arrest, his empire crumbled, and his grip on Nora's family finally shattered. As Nora and her mother reclaimed their home, they also reclaimed their lives, free from fear and manipulation. It was a hard-fought victory, but one that proved resilience and justice always prevail. If you found Nora's story inspiring, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in her shoes? Let's talk about it.